Vanessa, thanks so much for being here on Drinking with Gin.
Thank you for having me.
I've been so looking forward to this conversation, and we start every episode with what are you drinking? Are you drinking anything as we chat today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I usually drink seltzer with a little Mio in it, which is like a little flavoring.
Oh, I love that. I'm having water. I've already had my 2 cups of caffeine. You can probably hear in my voice. I'm like energized and ready to go. So I'm just having some water today as we chat. I want to say congratulations on your new book and all of the success that you've been having.
Thank you so much. I mean, it was definitely a long process and a very cathartic process, an important process. I know a lot of people were eager to hear what I had to say about, what I've kind of learned from so many of my clients, friends, followers, and evidence-based articles. So I'm really, really proud of it.
Well, and it's also beautiful. I love the peacock feathers on the front. Like that's such a good representation of, the content.
Yeah, I think most people don't realize that the narcissist is very much like a peacock in that they can be rather beautiful, but also really violent. So the peacock is actually a notoriously violent creature who's like, kind of fluffing and their feathers and looking so beautiful. And then lo and behold, they're not exactly as they seem.
Isn't that the truth? Oh my gosh. Well, I'm going to link your book in the show notes so that people can get a copy. It's called Narcissistic Abuse, a therapist's guide to identifying, escaping, and healing from toxic and manipulative people. Highly recommend it. I have not had a chance to get through the whole thing, but I've read a good chunk of it. I try to get through before I record with my guests, but I think maybe a helpful place to start, and you do talk a little bit about this in the book, a little bit of your own background, like um, parts of your story and what led you to this type of work.
So I kind of I grew up in New York, but I grew up in like there was a lot of like adversity. There was, not always food, not always heat. I was kind of like ragamuffin, Irish kid, oldest of three children. My two younger brothers relied on me for a lot of things because mother was working, sometimes two jobs, single mother. Um, Father was in the picture, but we would only see him, let's say, standard, like every other weekend, etc. So it was really kind of tough. My parents were kind of like hippies, and so we weren't getting a ton of guidance. And we kind of had to figure out a lot of stuff on our own. So, I in some ways think of myself as my brother's like primary caregiver a lot of the time. So it wasn't easy. Sometimes it was scary. There were times where we would be alone, at night and we were all single digits, kind of trying to sleep and not be afraid and stuff like that. I remember one time my cat walked across the piano that we had downstairs and it was like ding, ding, ding. I'm like, oh my God, we're all gonna die. So we sort of had that kind of upbringing. And in some ways it was really beautiful too, because we didn't have anybody feeding us misinformation. I think it really translated into me being somewhat of an independent thinker, not having like a ton of data being constantly fed into my brain to sort of corrupt and make me and groom me into something rather sheepish. So I am in some ways very grateful for that childhood, but it wasn't easy. And I think it really made me think about injustices. I think there was a lot of bullying. We always had hand-me-downs, my brothers and I. And I think I really resonated like with people that were disenfranchised. And I think that that stayed with me. And I wanted to make a change in the world. So I became a social worker. I got my master's at 42 years old, which was late. And I think that was the point. I went to USC. I got my master's in social work, but it was like a community organizing, social policy concentration. And that was the goal, was I was going to change the world. And then I realized I had to pay my bills. So I became a therapist, which I also love. And so the social worker kind of has that like variety of roles. And I have the advocacy leg through my run across various states or runs across various states. And then I have the micro lens, which is this therapy work that I do. So checks all the boxes for me. I love what I do. I feel like it's something I was meant to do or something like that. It feels kind of universally like connected for me. But I did have a like a hard childhood in a lot of ways, and then I try to give back.
So that's kind of where you get your compassion for helping other people.
Yeah, I feel very connected to that.
I love that. And it's so funny. I always say nothing happens by chance, right? Like I found you somehow and reached out and graciously you were like, yeah, I'll come on your podcast and talk about this topic that I'm so passionate about. But as you're saying that, when I was in college, I studied psychology and I wanted to be a therapist myself. And I had this, well, not a therapist. I don't even know exactly what I wanted to do, but I was very interested in studying people and why people do what they do. And I remember going through college and going through the courses, and I was like, yeah, but I'm going to need to pay the bills and like make money. And so I ended up shifting course. And when you said that, I could not have related to that more. I was like, oh my gosh. But obviously you've been a very successful therapist, which is great. And I just noticed in the background is a copy of your book, which is, and as I was describing it, hopefully people saw that in the background and saw how beautiful it is. So
Thank you.
you mentioned the running across the state in a wedding dress. Tell us a little bit about that, the why behind it, kind of how that came to fruition and what that means.
Yeah, so it was during the pandemic that I had the idea. I was on a run when I have most of my clever ideas. Like you were saying, I have a little coffee in the morning and off I go with kind of, manically discovering things and processing things. And I'm very, very sharp in the AM. So I came up with this idea and I thought, how can I shine a light on this insidious form of domestic violence that I didn't know about as a therapist? Um, and how do I get people to pay attention to this? What can I do? And I thought this was a really crazy idea. Why don't I do something really bold? And I called my friend Bob, who is an Iron Man like me, and I said, do you think I could run across the state of New York in a wedding dress to raise awareness? And he was like, fuck yeah. So I thought, oh, okay, I better get this together. And so the logistics of that included getting the route discovered, getting the attire made. My girlfriend Barry helped me to do that. And so many of the people that were involved behind the scenes to sort of carry me through that experience in terms of hotels donating their rooms to my team and myself. And, it was a big undertaking. It was 285 miles in 11 days, which is essentially a marathon a day. So we had to kind of train really hard, and then I had to wrap my one ankle that sometimes can be a little weird, um, and just barrel through it. And it was one of the most transformative experiences of my entire life. There was a lot of my own healing, but I think people also were watching that and being like, go, 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 Vanessa, because they are suffering in silence. I was fortunate enough to not be co-parenting with a narcissist. And what happens is those that are oftentimes being victimized for many, many years in post-separation abuse through the judicial system or the family court, which is the worst experience I have ever encountered or seen any of my clients encounter. Hard stop, period. This is where the narcissist exploits their children, and punishes their former supplies. And so I think it was also not just my own experience, it was really for those silent victims to have a voice, to be seen and validated and heard. And so it's, again, checked a bunch of boxes.
That is so cool. And especially coming from someone who has no desire to run one marathon ever in my life. And the fact that you basically did 11 back to back, day after day after day. Now, I will say I used to do like fundraiser bike rides where we'd bike like 100 miles a day, back to back to back for different organizations. So I can relate a little bit, but how cool. Like, what a great thing to be known for. I mean, like just a really cool experience. And thank you for doing that to raise awareness on this super important topic.
Thank you so much. It was good because it got me in front of some important PR people. It got me in front of Gretchen Carlson, which got me um, the book deal. So I guess all of this to say that if you feel like you want to make some noise, or if you feel like this is a crazy idea, I could never do that, do it. Because that's how things change. That's how you get attention to important matters is you do the crazy thing, you do the bold thing, you do the thing that, others might think is whatever the hell they're going to think. Listen, people are going to say and think whatever they're going to say and think anyway. So you might as well do the bold thing. And so that is really another box that it checks. It's like a testament to like, do the crazy thing, as long as you're not hurting anybody, do that thing, make some noise, be, the voice, be loud. If you can, obviously protect yourself. But I think that was important too. People were like, you can't do that. That's crazy. I was like, watch me.
It's that's almost like more like fuel, isn't it? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
tell me I can't do something and I'll
Yes.
show you that I can. But on the flip side of that, especially when you're saying like if you can do that bold thing, like do that thing that might seem a little bit wild or crazy. So often victims and survivors of narcissist abuse lose that confidence. They lose that sense of themselves. And so what would you say to them when they're feeling that way, that they've maybe lost their self-worth and lost that confidence to do things that they love and are really passionate about?
I think you have to connect to people that are secure, that are validating, that are tough, that will hold space for you. I think you have to remove yourself from the environment that the narcissist is in, because the cognitive dissonance that comes from that and the confusion will sort of disallow you from growth. It's like you're almost treading water and you're never really, having clarity of mind. Only with time and distance from toxic people can you actually begin to get empowered again, or empowered in the first place especially if you have a narcissistic parent. And so you're removing yourself from those environments and then sort of locking arms with safe, strong people, um, and collaborate and, find a narc savvy therapist and journal and process the things that you've endured. Going through narcissistic abuse is to experience trauma. That is the thing. It's gaslighting alone will traumatize you because the brain is a fact-finding tool. And so when it gets confused, when it sort of misfires, when it's not really functioning and seeing mistruths, or you're being fed lies repeatedly, you will sustain an injury to the brain. And so you have to get out of that environment. You have to find people that are truth tellers, that are safe. And that can take a lot of work. It's hard to discover who, is authentic. But I think probably until you feel sturdy enough and find your legs again, try to lock arms with people that understand this.
Thank you for saying that. And as a survivor myself, it's so relatable. And I often say it's kind of like you can't see the forest for the trees. Like when you're in it, it's so hard to see the big picture. But once you can step away from it and you get that little bit of clarity, you can't ever unsee what you see very clearly. And that's one of the most, to me, like one of the most empowering, like powerful moments of the journey when you're like, that's what it is. And so having people like you to share tips and tools and, that perspective is so helpful. And I do want to get really quickly here into the heart of what we came to talk about today, because you have such a unique perspective on cults and that dotted line to narcissism, or maybe it's a direct line, maybe it's a full filled in line. And so I really want to dive into that because this is something that no one else is talking about. But I want to talk about a term that stood out to me in your book that I've not talked about here on the podcast before. We hear gaslighting, we hear love bombing. I've covered Darvo, but I've never covered coercive control. And that just like literally stood out on the page for me. And I would love to hear your perspective, what it is, how do we see it, navigate it? Because I think this is a hot topic that we're not hearing a ton about.
So coercive control is really synonymous with narcissistic abuse. It is also synonymous with domestic violence. It is also synonymous with cult abuse. So they really are the exact same things. Coercive control are that term is used by people that are tending to stay away from the clinical term of narcissistic abuse, right? So if you are not a clinician like myself, you might refer to it as coercive control. I prefer the clinical terms of narcissistic abuse as a clinician because I like the power that it has. It's really descriptive. This is what it is. This is the disorder. This is the non-neurotypical broken brain that the disordered person has. It's a pathological disorder. And so, as somebody who's very science-brained like myself, I prefer the clinical language. So, but they are really just the same thing.
That's really helpful. And so I think that's helpful to like provide that perspective of if someone hears that word or sees that word, it's the same thing, right? But just described in a different way. Thank you for that. All right, since you brought up too, that was like a nice tie-in that you're seeing, like, okay, we hear this with narcissism, we hear it with cult leaders, it's all the same thing. Walk me through how you came to this realization, and maybe we'll probably like get to some examples of cult leaders so that people can really see how it's applicable in everyday life, like who they're seeing, how this is showing up. But what was it that made you kind of draw that line and go, oh my gosh, this is all the same thing here?
Yeah, I was when I started to sort of study this really deeply, I began to bump elbows with some of the heavy hitters in my space in terms of clinicians that were treating victims of narcissists. And then I began to connect with people that had experienced abuse by a narcissist in a collective. So this was the cult experience. And I began to see that some of the people that had experienced narcissistic abuse by a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath in a collective, those collectives were not just the sort of stereotypical cult of 500 people, 900 people, 100 people. Some of the cults, like the Stolen Youth cult, which happened in New York, were only like a gaggle of people. And then I would start to understand and study the cult leaders' tactics, the behaviors, the way that they would manipulate what was working. And it was absolutely the same thing. I was looking at the cult leader and I was discovering that oftentimes they were unassuming, like Keith Raniere from the Nexium cult, where, he looks like the guy next door, or he looks like my plumber, or he's not overt. He's not sort of the quintessential douchebag, pop collar jerk that you think a narcissist is going to be. He's very covert. He's very guru. He's very kind of flies under the radar version of this. And so when I began to really look at the characteristics, I realized like you could be in a cult of one. And so if you're in a relationship with a narcissist or have been in the past, you were in a cult, period. That's it. If they are actually a narcissist and have NPD, or they are a sociopath or a psychopath, you were in a cult of one. You can be in a cult in your family system. So we see this with something that's particularly hierarchical, where there's like, this authoritarian figure who is running the show, and then everybody is sort of falling in line. We see the flying monkeys or the minions in that environment who will, be groomed by the narcissist and do their bidding. And so it really began to click for me. And it was like unbelievably like a light bulb went on over my head. And I was like, this is the same thing. And so I began to sort of chat with a lot of people that had extricated themselves from cults and, sort of developed an understanding of those parallels and wanted to write a book about that specifically. And it was funny because when I pitched the book to the publishing company, they were like, "Ooh, I don't know, that is that it?" Like, because people are not really sort of understanding and willing to say I was in a cult. Why? Because there's a stigma, there's shame that comes from that. Like, for me to say I was in a cult, I don't mind to say that because I understand exactly what was going on. People just don't identify as having been victimized by a cult leader when they're in a relationship with somebody who's, hitting them or is, somebody who's abusing them psychologically. But that is what it is, because basically you begin to study the characteristics and the luring and the love bombing and the grooming, the manipulation and the isolation, and then it clicks and you will quickly understand they are the same.
I just had like 17 aha moments when you were talking. And a couple of things I just want to hit on is guilt and shame. It's
Mm.
a huge reason why I shared my story and wrote my book, is to help remove stigma, shame, guilt that we feel around enduring and going through these experiences. Because I think so often people feel like they're alone. Someone really near and dear to me the other night, we got together and they opened up and shared with me the only person that they've shared with that they have been struggling with mental health. They've been struggling with going through depression. And I was like, who else have you talked to? And they're like, no one. I can't talk to my family. They'll judge me. And I just like, this is such an important thing. So like, if you are struggling or suffering in silence, you're not alone. Reach out to somebody that you trust, that you feel safe with, a therapist, a coach, whoever that is, a friend, whatever that looks like. Don't suffer in silence. Like, I just really can't emphasize that enough. And do you want to say anything further about that?
Yeah, I think that's really what's important with the book is that we really do aim to not only fuse the concepts of narcissistic abuse and cult abuse, but that lays the groundwork for the destigmatizing of it, right? So this idea that it could happen to anyone, you can be extremely intelligent. We are all vulnerable to mind control, and it happens very, slowly. And so you're not going to see it coming unless you really pay attention ahead of time. But yeah, we really aim to destigmatize the sort of those words like being in a cult or being in a domestic violence relationship.
Yeah, I love to use this example all of the time. Someone had posted on a reel when I guested on a podcast, and they're like, "You're not very smart." And they didn't spell "your" right. So I just corrected it and then moved on with my day. But I think that's a really big misperception, is that people think you're dumb for falling prey to these types of dangerous personalities. And you're not. Actually, I think they often target smart people, successful people, because they want to ride on their coattails and
I don't
achieve.
I don't know that they target anyone specifically. I think what people think is that they're going after a certain person. I think that ideally they would like to, as you mentioned, have that kind of arm candy or those kinds of, minions or that harem. Yes, for sure. But by and large, they are casting out lines all the time. And if whoever takes the bait, does it have a pulse? That's their gauge. They don't care. Are you going to be able to feed me attention and do what I need you to do? That's it. I don't care. Man, woman, child, animal, they have absolutely no care in the world. It's just, are you going to feed me what I need at the moment? So, but yeah, ideally, that would be something they would be looking for. And I definitely think that I'm an intelligent person. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that I grew up in an environment where I was primed for servitude or was going to be easily groomed, considering it was like I thought of myself as an independent thinker, and yet here I was. It's like you don't know what you don't know what you don't know. And how in the world are you going to ever imagine that people are like quote unquote evil or deviant or seeking to harm you? If you have a neurotypical brain, it is extremely difficult to process that other people are differently brained, that they are going to be thinking differently. I would say that's probably the biggest challenge for most of my clients is this idea like, I don't understand. Why do they do this? The logic is you have to throw that right out the window because this is, it's a different way that they think, period. They do not think the way that you do. I mean, sometimes if you think about like a Ted Bundy, to look at Ted Bundy is again another example of somebody who's particularly unassuming. You wouldn't say, oh, he looks like a monster. Um, But think about the things that he was capable of doing. That's not happening in a faraway land. That's happening in your neighborhood. These things are going on around you. People who are very, very dangerous are all around you. This is just the way it is. You just don't know it. It looks like a normal human being, and it's sort of flitting about in your neighborhood. And so I think there's so much work that we need to be done, that we need to be doing around, what do monsters look like? What are they capable of? This idea like, I don't, this person was nice to me, or I haven't had that experience. Okay, that's fine. But it's happening around you. People are very sort of dangerous, even in your neighborhood. And they can do this for many, many, many years. A lot of my clients come to me after a marriage of 30 plus years, where, it's like, surprise, I've been having this whole double life and a whole other family and a whole other land for the entire time. And now you have STDs, and now you have a full mortgage to pay because I've been tucking money away, and surprise. Like, so these things are going on all around us, and we have so much work to do in terms of describing what monsters really are.
Mm. And they really are. I love that you've been using that word monster. And if you've endured it, and when you said it's happening all around, I want to just touch on that. I think so often it's attributed to romantic relationships, but you brought up having a narcissistic parent. I have one. Narcissistic family members. I have them. I've had narcissistic relationships with friends and coworkers. And I think going back to what you were talking earlier about the narcissists and the cult and the stigma and the shame, one of the things that I was really relating to was one of the things that they all instill in you is fear of losing them or fear of leaving. And that was like a big light bulb moment for me, like especially making that correlation. I remember like the anxiety that you feel when you're like wanting to untangle from a narcissist, like, well, if I send them this, they might react this way. And it's I like that's what I kept going back to, is this fear that the victim or the survivor feels in that moment of losing them or leaving, because they've really instilled that.
Yeah, I think what happens is we develop a trauma bond. When you go through the cycle of abuse, it looks like the love bombing, the devalue, and then the discard. And on the second time, it looks like makeup session, tension building, fallout. Makeup session, tension building, fallout. And this cycle continues until you develop such a desire for the makeup session. Make it okay again, because it's so good when that happens. Everything is fine. I just need that dopamine kick. Please, whatever I have to do. And so it becomes like a drug addiction. And you become stuck because it's almost like Stockholm. They're the only people who can fix this. They're the only people who can give you that fix. And so you wait and you pray, and then they realize you're waiting and praying. So they turn up the dial. And so the abuse gets worse over time, over time, over time. But it is extremely difficult to extricate yourself from these environments, extremely difficult. And then throw in the mortgage and throw in the children and the career. And to your point, they will actually be very intimidating. They will say things to you like, I will make sure no one believes you. I will take the kids from you. And you're isolated. They have taken away your friends, maybe your career. You might be, taking care of young children. And so they will kind of make it so that it's almost impossible for you to have any sense of self, let alone get out of those environments. And it is really petrifying. I'm not going to lie. When you get out of the environment, that's really when the abuse starts. Whether they leave you or you leave them, it's just going to be hell. There's no way of sugarcoating this. If you get away from a narcissist, they can be particularly sadistic, and the idea that you might leave them, forget it. It's like, don't you know who I am? You don't leave me, because they live in a fantasy world. Oftentimes they're delusional around how wonderful they think they are. And so this is a fracture to the ego that is not, something that they can actually endure. And I think it's also a good moment to kind of highlight that it is no different in a cult. We saw this with Leah Remini when she tried to get away from the cult, the post-separation abuse and the death threats and the things that all of the minions of Scientology were doing and stalking her and, financial abuse through the court system. So we see the exact same things happening when you try to get away from a cult as, of many or of one. It is the same thing. It's just, don't you know who I am? You're not going to be able to go out there and expose me for what I really am. I'm going to destroy you and silence you. And so it's really horrifying that these people are able to get away with this. And I think the biggest part that we need to work on is the judicial system, so we can kind of, really have people in positions of power that can be able to understand what's happening and care enough to do something to protect victims, because they are creating damage in so many different environments.
Absolutely. I haven't talked about this publicly, but one of the worst situations that I've encountered with a narcissist is having a tenant that is a narcissist. They violated the terms of their lease with me over 50 times. And then when they didn't get their full security deposit back, they sued me. And now they are trying to like not cash and I lost because
Yep.
they committed perjury. They lied in court and I had to pay back some of that money. And now they're not cashing the check and are threatening that they're going to. And of course, I have like a nearly perfect credit score. Theirs sucks. She is vindictive. One
Mhm.
of the worst humans I have ever encountered. And there's no protection for landlords in the court system. None. You know what recourse I had? Like none. And it's so frustrating. And you see it on that side and you're just like nodding along, going, oh, I feel your pain. It's
It's so
awful.
true. What a great way to really frame this, though, is that it's not just in interpersonal relationships. That's the thing. This isn't sort of like a tirade that Vanessa Reiser's on because she got scorned. This is about shining a light on people that are vindictive, sadistic, and the damage that they create. As you mentioned, you have perfect credit, and here you now have to deal with this energy grab from this psychopath who is trying to destroy your life. And this is what they do. And so, thank you for saying that. I similarly, during COVID, had a tenant that would not leave and extorted money just so I had to like, she destroyed my house and I had to like pay her to get out of
Yeah.
my house, even though she was not COVID affected. And it didn't last too long. It was only like 3 months, but I could only imagine. I was homeless for that time, and I could only imagine, what it would be like for this to be rather prolonged and have to go to court with somebody, who is basically victimizing me. And so I understand that, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. It comes in so many different shapes and sizes.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to my rant.
No, that was great.
But no, and I think that's what people don't realize, right? Or like how you're talking about in the court system, how they will use and leverage things to extort and exploit. And it's not, and then when you try to defend yourself, then you look defensive, right?
Mhm.
And when really you're the one that is being attacked. And it's just so frustrating. Okay, so sorry about that little tangent, but it seemed appropriate because again, we so often think of it as a romantic relationship and it can come in so many different forms and shapes. And that's why you bring up this cult format and what happens when someone tries to leave. It's like, how many times have you heard the phrase, after everything I've done for you, right?
That's
Like,
true.
I feel like that's like a standard verbiage that they all got in their handbook, their playbook of
Yeah,
narcissism.
because everything for them is a transaction. Everything for them is a ledger. They are looking to one up all the time. They are always fast drivers, line cutters, cheaters. And so they're always tallying everything at all times. They have to win. And so that experience is very synonymous with anybody who has gone through narcissistic abuse, is sort of witnessing that they have to one up. They have to have the victory. When, the real sort of the laugh is on them, because anytime you get away from a narcissist, you win automatically. I don't care if you have to cut your arm off and flee, you automatically win. But they, and you win also because they sort of have a lower baseline. They are living in absolute discontent all the time. So they're sort of, to oversimplify, sort of like miserable people. There's a hole in the bucket. They are not able to be satiated. They don't feel much of anything. So they have to kind of poke and antagonize to get a rise out of people to feel much of anything. And so they're sort of like they're kind of like a vacant creature. And this is oftentimes why they become very chameleon-like, and they try to find your hobbies and sort of, pretend to be all these things because they have no real identity. So anytime you get away from them, you win, but they think they're winning. It's like sometimes it's good to just lay down and make them think they're winning. It's like, you know what, you're right, you win. Go ahead with that. Like, who cares? But yeah, it's a lot of resources and energy that go into managing this and how to get away from them.
Do you find that's why the gray rock method is so effective? Because you finally get them, like you become so disinteresting, you stop sharing information, you cut out, you limit or cut off contact, and then they discard you because you're not fueling their need. And they think that they won because they discarded you. But all along, that's what you were trying to get by using the gray rock method.
Yeah. I have a client who described towards the end of the relationship, her abuser would constantly in the morning be kind of, giving her a hard time when she would leave the bed. It would be kind of like, where are you going? Where are you going? And she used to try to rationalize with him. And then at the end, she was, sort of like, just ignore, go make coffee and carry on with the day. Um, and this was sort of where I think she started to get the real punishment because I guess the narcissist believes, oh, you're on to me now. You're not going to be feeding me that supply, even through argument. Negative attention for them is attention still. And so for her, it was, kind of shutting that off to your point and sort of realizing like there is no point in giving you any fuel right now. It's not worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future. To sort of have these circular conversations with you and babysit your fragile ego all day is not going to be part of my repertoire. See you later. And that, can be something that is valuable. Certainly if you've gotten away from them, it is. If you are co-parenting, it is. Anytime you give information to a narcissist, they will exploit it. So if little Timmy is not to be eating peanut butter and you are co-parenting with little Timmy as your child, and you say to the narcissist, little Timmy is not to have peanut butter, there is an allergy, you're only guaranteeing that little Timmy gets peanut butter, and you will be blamed for said allergic reaction. So you can't really give them information. You can't give them information in couples counseling. They will exploit that. So you sort of begin to realize over time that anytime you engage with them, you only give them information that they will use against you.
You've brought up co-parenting with a narcissist a handful of times, and I always say I do not envy anyone that has to do that. I feel like that is when you have the worst of it.
Yep.
And I've had therapists on before, I've had psychologists on that talk about how to co-parent, like some really beneficial tips and tricks. What I would love to do with our remaining time here today, because of your expertise as a therapist specializing in this area, is to talk about the healing journey. And I know in the book you share some really great techniques to implement on the healing journey from cults, narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths, right? We kind of put them all in this one big dangerous bucket. What are some of the things that would be the top things that you would recommend for people?
I love this. I feel like I've entered into like a certain tier of this myself. Um, Treat yourself as if you are treating a friend who has been in a horrific car accident. And what does that look like? I am talking about radical self-love. I am talking about heated and weighted blankets. I am talking about candles, warm chicken soup, jazz music, um, laughter with friends, comedy shows, just the coziest and most nurturing, really, really loving environments because it is a trauma and you really need to structure this into your day. You need to find the time to get grounded, to snuggle with an animal. You have to go to the five senses, so imagery, look at things that are gorgeous, look at humor, taste, have a really, really sort of nourishing palate at that point, a good diet that is, really smells and tastes that are phenomenal. Um, Lighting candles, finding something that sort of makes your shoulders drop and your brow unclench and your jaw unclench and your fists unclench. Because we live in a fight or flight when you go through trauma and you're living with PTSD or CPTSD. And so your body is holding on to that. And so if you don't pay attention to this, your cortisol levels are going to rise and you can become sick. You can develop autoimmune disorders, disease. And so you really need to make this a priority. Um, in any ways that you can. I like to listen to music, like, anything that's kind of without lyrics, really, because I don't want to get into anything too heady. I want something maybe like, clarinet, sort of, Benny Goodman jazz, stuff like this. So really paying attention to the five senses to get yourself grounded, stay connected to safe people, safe friends, people that you love. And I think that is kind of the fundamentals of it, right? So like not necessarily the journaling and the processing, while that's really important. I'm talking about the real sort of core wound care that you need to get involved in, and that healing is going to be the five senses. So go there. I mean, I love to snuggle with my dog. That is like my number one thing because it checks a bunch of boxes because it's like the smells, the sights, like, and so, yeah, I think the healing can be found there.
Oh, that was incredible. And it's also really validating for me. So part of my coaching model, the third component is nurture. And this is a lot of what I talk about of like really fully taking care of yourself. And also, I'm a huge dog lover. What kind of dog do you have?
I have a golden retriever. She's my third. I'm thinking about getting another one. She's crazy, but we just love her so much.
Oh, dogs are the best. So actually when I was going through my experience, you talked about autoimmune disease and how trauma shows up in our body. I got shingles on my face during
Mhm.
my experience, which you're just going, yeah, that tracks, right?
Mhm.
But I got Francine, she's a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel,
Oh, yeah.
in the midst of what I was going through. We were supposed to get a dog together. He pushed for it, and we split up in the meantime. I already had this appointment. I ended up going. She wasn't for sale. It was a whole thing. I say that we saved each other.
Oh.
And, so I really do think that, connection with animals is so important too. Like that you brought that up as even an example. I feel like so many people will relate to that.
Yeah, I think paying close attention to that as a matter of self-care is so important. Puppies are really challenging and there can be a lot of work there, but it's also so valuable. I think that is my baseline. People ask me like, if you had all the money in the world, what would you do? And I'd say, well, I would open up a vineyard and I would open up a golden retriever, sort of breeding, and I would have just golden retrievers kind of running all around the vineyard. That would be like if I had all the money in the world, that's how I would spend my days, is just around puppies running around open fields, right? So like even that imagery is comforting to me. It's like, oh, it's just a picture of it, right? So it is dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a special therapy that I practice to go to the five senses. And so there's tons of data. It's not just me, sort of pulling this out of thin air. There's tons of data on how that gets people grounded. And, animals are, the chef's kiss for that experience.
Well, and the way you give an example for each sense too, I think everybody can be like, okay, well, music, maybe jazz isn't mine, but, or maybe clarinet's not mine, but I love piano or whatever it is. And also like taking away the lyrics, because how easy is it to get sucked into listening to sad songs, and then just start crying and start the whole cycle. And not to say that crying is bad. Like you got to feel all your feelings. Like I'm a big proponent of cognitive diffusion. Like allow the feelings that are coming, acknowledge them, don't try to just shove them under the rug, but then pay attention to how you want to feel and like
Yeah.
not attach yourself to like those feelings aren't who you are. They're what you're
Right.
feeling in the moment. But yeah, so that's all like a big part of that process too. Oh my gosh, Vanessa, I'm sure I could talk to you for hours and just like continue to have you share your wisdom with the gems here on Drinking with Jen. But are there any final thoughts that you want to leave us with that I didn't cover with you today?
Yeah, I think what's important for people to understand is that if you are in a cult of one or a cult of many, you might be looking at the numbers. You might be saying to yourself, I'm outnumbered. There are so many people that love my abuser. I must be the problem because I am the outlier. I'm outnumbered. All of these people seem to be subscribing to this narrative. And I would just say to you that numbers do not truth make. That does not translate into truth. And so find the truth, stay anchored in the truth, whatever the truth is in your story, and you know what the truth is, stay there because you can be wickedly outnumbered. We see this in political environments. We see this in enormous cults. We see this in family systems, very, very dynamic and big family systems that are abusive, where you are wickedly outnumbered. Maybe you're the black sheep. It does not change the truth. The numbers don't change the truth. The truth is always going to be the truth. So just find that and stay there.
Yeah. And I think trusting yourself enough to know, like, I think oftentimes people that are in these sorts of environments start to ignore their intuition and not trust themselves because they've been gaslit and made to feel like, well, I know this happened. Like, I know in my soul, I know in my bones. But then you get gaslit, you start to question reality, like, really going back to trusting what you're feeling, trusting your gut, trusting your intuition, and knowing what the truth really is.
Right.
That's so key. Thank you so much. And how can people find you that want to follow along for more?
Sure. So on Instagram at Vanessa Reiser, LCSW. My website is tell, therapist.net. We have a nonprofit, therapist.org, where we will connect you to a narc savvy clinician in your respective state. But yeah, you can find me anywhere on social media.
Amazing. And I'll link all of that to your website, your nonprofit organization, which is wonderful to help connect people with experts in their area, and your social media, and of course, your book so that people can grab a copy of that right away. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise today, Vanessa. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much.